Hi, welcome to another edition of Meet the Author. Tonight we have Roberta J. Buland, who is an editor. What Roberta does is general editing, copy content editing, developmental editing, project management, writing and co-writing, substantive editing, indexing, proofreading, and rewriting. How are you, Roberta?
I'm fine, thank you for having me on the show.
Roberta is the editor for the magazine of the CAPA, Connecticut Authors and Publishers Association. Well, she has not really the editor, but she has a
used to be the editor, yes.
But she has a column called the ABCs of the Editing Process. And some of the titles, which she's going to talk about, some of the titles of the articles that she writes are abbreviations, remembrance of things past, how long does it take to edit a manuscript, writing to standard English, adding new words to English, and why might you need an editor? Well, let's start with that one. Why might you need an editor? Roberta.
The reason you need an editor usually is because anything you write, as you know, you make mistakes. And when you make your own mistakes, you keep reading it over and over again, and you don't correct your mistakes because you don't see them. So you always need another pair of eyes to look at it and make sure that everything you want to say is said correctly and written correctly.
Do you have any interesting stories of editing mistakes that were made or things that you had to correct?
Well, I always have to correct because I have yet to come across the perfect book or the perfectly written article. So I always correct. I have certain standards that are pretty much industry standards. For example, when you're writing narrative, you're describing things, not necessarily the dialogue. You want to write it in good standard English because that demonstrates your respect for the language and your knowledge of the language.
Do you say good standard English or proper standard English?
Proper standard English works also. If you're writing dialogue, however, you want to write as people speak. So you're going to leave off endings, you're going to put in extra words, you're just going to kind of talk like every day. And by the way the characters speak, or the way an author speaks, is how people get to know who you are and the different characters in a book.
And how do you prepare some of the articles that you're writing, like why might you need an editor? Where do you get the ideas from?
Ideas come to me in many ways, most often when I'm not thinking and maybe dreaming at night, but also people ask me questions, and I say, oh, that might make a good article. And then I do some research on the internet, because the internet has everything. And I try to condense and just make it easy enough for people to understand. Because the articles that I write are anywhere from 500 to 800 words, so it's not a lot to read and digest. But it has to be written so that people will understand them and understand why they might need an editor or why they make certain mistakes that they make.
And Roberta brought some magazines and books as examples of things that she edited or helped write. Can you show us some of these?
Sure.
You can stand them up.
This is one of my proudest achievements because Dr. Henry Lee, whom everybody knows as the forensic scientist, as one of the people at the O.J. Simpson trial, who was one of the experts there, co-wrote a book with a very prolific author who writes mystery thrillers, who's also a retired doctor, so he sets all his novels in the hospital.
And the name of the book is Famous Crimes.
But this is Famous Crimes Revisited. And what they did was they went back to Sacco Vanzetti, which was in the 20s, right up through the O.J. Simpson trial, and they rewrote the trials as if they had modern technology, like modern DNA. And how would that have affected the outcome of the trials?
And and how was the editing process, if you can say something about
that?
Well,
one thing was that this was written around 2000, and they wanted to call it Crimes of the Century. And I told them that which century would you be talking about? Because by the time the book came out, it was probably 2001. And, we didn't have that many crimes in 1 year. So I suggested they change the title, and they agreed with me. So that was pretty neat. That was really pretty neat. And so that was this book, and this is available in paper. It's available everywhere. And since then, of course, both Jerry Labriola and Dr. Lee have written many more books, screenplays, scripts, etc.
Have you done other books for them, or just that one?
No, not for Henry Lee, but for Jerry Labriola. I did several books, especially among his earlier works, before he was with a commercial publisher.
Okay. And
So
you have
that was interesting.
the next book, Biblical Beauty. I like that
Biblical
title.
Beauty, which is Ancient Secrets and Modern Solutions. And this is based on women in the Bible and how they became beautiful, like Cleopatra and Deborah and others. And the author tells the beauty secrets of the ancient people and then applies them to modern times. So she tells you what you can do, what to look for in the stores, what's going to work, what's not going to work.
You have one beauty secret?
One beauty secret is to make sure your skin is very clean before you apply any makeup.
And did they have a special way of cleaning it in the old days?
In the old days, we believe they used a lot of water and oils. But we're not sure. You know, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of information, so people have kind of expanded on and expounded on what was in the Bible. But she did a very good job, and she also did a wonderful job of including a lot of charts and graphs, and putting things, I don't know if you can see this, but shading, so that people can easily pick up all the secrets and know that anything that's shaded is going to be about secrets.
What did you have to do in the editing process on this book?
Oh, we did everything from the beginning. The woman who wrote it, Rochelle Weisberger, is from New Jersey. She's not a writer. She doesn't call herself a writer, although she did pretty well. But we had to really rewrite a lot of it and reorganize it so that it would be easy for the average woman to understand. There's even some secrets for men in it.
Well, that's true, because someone who might be a researcher doesn't necessarily make him or her an author.
That's right.
It's a whole separate business.
And this is one of the reasons why I do some ghostwriting, because people...
Well, I've heard about ghostwriting. Tell me about that.
Well, people who have ideas for a book or an article but don't really know how to organize it or how to put it down on paper. For example, one of the works I've been heavily involved in for the last 6 months or so is a memoir about an 89-year-old man who's a businessman in Connecticut, and he wants to leave a legacy to his children. He has trouble writing with his hands. He's got some issues, so he tape records all of his stories into a tape recorder. He sends them to a transcriber who emails me the raw data. And I take it and I rewrite it and organize it for him. And we're also working on the pictures that are going to go in the book.
Do you know any? I know of some famous biographies that were ghost-written. Do you know any offhand?
Do I know any? Most
Autobiographies
of the
or
most of the glamour people don't really write themselves. They have a ghostwriter, and many of the politicians do too, because they don't have the time and energy to devote. They don't want to devote that. It's not where they want to put their resources. They want to be elected and reelected. So they usually have somebody writing along with them. Even Ted Kennedy did that when he wrote his last memoir. He had a co-writer.
He had a co-writer, and there were other famous people who also did that.
Right.
I hear America Talking.
Well,
That's interesting.
This is edited by Stuart Berg Flexner. It was one of my very early jobs where we had to research Americanisms, like the Statue of Liberty or the word okay. And we went to the library. There were a bunch of us. There was a team, and we were all assigned certain words. We went to the library. We did the research. The reference librarians loved us because we gave them a lot of challenges. And then we wrote the actual entries in the book. There are many, many. This is the gay 90s, for example.
What do you mean by an entry?
The various words or phrases that were very American. The flying machine, for example, which was Wilbur Orville Wright's first airplane. So we did some history and some research on each one. And Stuart Berg Flexner, who unfortunately is no longer with us, was an expert on American slang. And he's written the Dictionary of American Slang. And then he just expanded into this kind of book, which is more prose than just definitions.
We have two more examples.
This is one of my more recent books, which I think is one of the best books I ever edited. It's by Dick Barbieri. It's called The Edge. And it's about a man who attempts suicide, and his wife believes he is dead, and she collects insurance and all the kinds of things that happen, including mafia involvement. It's a short book. It's succinct. It's very well done, and this is a first book by the author, and I'm hoping he'll write some more. I brought along a variety of books to show that there are so many different books that can be edited in different ways. And this one is called The Master Copy by Mary Osterman and Larry Osterman, and it's about, they figured out with DNA how to clone Jesus Christ. Obviously it's fiction, but it's a good read. So these were only some of the books on my bookshelf that I thought would present a variety of what I have done. Now, when I lived in Israel...
Now, Roberta, you also lived in Israel, and she edited this magazine?
This was a magazine that I helped give birth to. The first issue actually took 9 months.
Well, tell us a little bit, before you mention that, about, you said you lived in Israel. How many years did you live there?
I was there for 5 years. I was there from 1985 to 1989. It was a stable time in Israel. We had a lot of fun as a family there. My son went to high school there. And I was asked to be the managing editor of a magazine for English speakers who didn't speak Hebrew.
In the Tel Aviv area.
What?
You said it was a Tel Aviv area, that magazine.
Right, the Tel Aviv area. It was mostly the Sharon Valley, which are actually suburbs.
North of Tel Aviv.
Was Hoda Sharon, Herzliya, Kfar Saba, that area.
On the Mediterranean,
which you know,
north of Tel Aviv.
you know very well because you lived there even longer. And the reason I brought this particular issue along is because I wrote the main story called Waiting for Our Sons, and it was about a family who lost whose son was captured by the enemy at the time and held for many, many years, and eventually, unfortunately, they killed him and his bones were brought back. But it was a very trying time for this family. And I couldn't interview the parents. They wouldn't talk to the press. But the older brother did talk to me. And it was harrowing for me. It was painful. And it was a good story and sold a lot of copies because people could relate to it. I could relate to it. I had a young son. He could have been captured if he'd gone in the army. So it was one of those things that I felt was important.
Is that magazine still in
No. When the first Intifada started, the publisher had to go into the reserves, and he had to stop publication.
Oh, okay.
So, and that's what happens in Israel. You know, the whole country.
It's a citizen army.
Yeah. Right. The whole country.
Well, you also mentioned something else about Israel. There was an Israeli prime minister named Yehuda Olmert, and you said you actually did some editing for him. What did you do with him?
Well, there were a lot of professors at Tel Aviv University, and I made this great connection at Tel Aviv University to help people in politics and other fields improve their English. So they would write in this kind of Hebrew structure English, which was difficult to understand.
Hebrew English.
English, or whatever you want to call it. And what I did was I rewrote and helped them to put it into publishable form so that they could submit their articles to English language magazines and they would have more coverage than if it were just in Israel.
Okay, that's a very good position. You also said you wrote something about coming back to America, the Apollo 11. What did you write for that?
The first spaceship, manned space flight that we sent in the late 60s into space. I was working at the time for a textbook publisher called Cambridge Publishing in Bronxville, New York. And as soon as man landed on the moon, the publisher came to me and said, today's assignment is to rewrite 3 pages of an American history book talking about the landing and the moon and all that. And I thought, this is pretty nice for someone in her early 20s to be able to write part of American history. I mean, what could be better than that? So that was pretty exciting. And later on, for that same company, I almost totally rewrote an economics book by a professor I knew who was really a good professor, but his English was not so great. So that was my experience
And
there.
what did you do you said also you had some experience working with Reader's Digest?
Yes, Reader's Digest is located in Pleasantville, New York, and I was living at the time not very far from there in Westchester County.
I passed by once.
You passed by. It's
Yeah.
a huge, huge place.
Yeah.
And what I did for them, I did a variety of things for them and then for subcontractors. And one of the things I did for them was to read books and write a synopsis to submit for condensation. So because Reader's Digest has a lot of condensed books, and somebody had to figure out which ones to condense. So
Now-
that was an exciting part of my work with them.
And you also have a company now called The Right Words Unlimited.
Yes.
You went to become self-employed. And can you tell me a little bit about how come you decided to try this, to be self-employed, and
I'm one
how
of
it's
these
been
people.
working?
Yeah, I'm one of these people who didn't stay with any company too long, and I finally realized that the only boss that wouldn't get rid of me or wouldn't
Fire
have
you.
a problem would be myself. And also, I had kind of a double-edged aim. I wanted to emulate my father, who was a successful businessman, but I also wanted to publish.
What was his business?
His business was, he used to have a company called Friend's Frozen Foods. My maiden name was Friend, Friend. And I'm from Chester, Connecticut originally. And he distributed frozen foods and ice cream to the eastern part of Connecticut. And we always had plenty of ice cream in the house. And he worked very hard, but he enjoyed his work. And he said the best thing to do is be in your own business. So finally I took the plunge. And, of course, I love editing. In fact, and I love writing. I'm in the process of writing my own memoirs called Memoirs of an Editorial Addict.
And you're that's interesting. Sort of
Yeah.
like Jim Cramer, who wrote the book about his own biography about working on the stock market, a street addict, whatever it was called.
Right, yeah.
That reminds me.
So I'm kind of keeping notes in a journal to eventually
And
publish.
this is going to be your own first book?
This will either be my first book, or the other book I'm working on is a saga, a family saga of 100 years that will be a novel.
And do you have an editor?
Do I have an editor? I
Yeah.
have plenty of sources.
Yeah, so you haven't decided yet to get
Well,
an
you know,
editor.
CAPA, as we know,
Connecticut
Connecticut
Authors
Authors
and
and Publishers
Publishers
Association, which anyone who is at all related or in the publishing, writing, marketing business of books ought to belong to, because it's a networking group and an educational group. And we are Connecticut-based. We have over 250
And
members.
I like
and
that-
there's plenty of editors there to help me.
Well, I like the idea that they're also connecting authors and publishing, even though it's two separate businesses,
Right.
but they are connected, and it's not, it's a little bit unique to see an organization that combines the two. They usually have reading groups or editing groups
Right. This
or
is,
publishing groups,
right.
but
This
to
is
put them
not a
both together.
critique group. Originally, it was called Connecticut Authors Association, and then we realized we had several publishers who were members, and editors, and graphic designers. So we tried to expand it so that
Well,
it
you
would
actually
include
were there
everyone.
with almost with the founding,
I
so you
was.
know how it started. So tell us a little bit
was.
about how it started. That's interesting.
I was approached by the two founders at the time to come to a board meeting, and the board meeting was going to be in a bookstore right near where I lived. And I said, well, this can't be so bad. So I went to the meeting, and I was really struck by the professionalism of these men and what their goals and aims were. And the group was really small at that time. And as time went on, we marketed and we became much larger. And now we have presence at the Big E, and we have our own university day, and we have a lot of activities to
And
help
actually,
writers.
You mentioned that you edited the book for Dr. Henry Lee and Dr. Jerry Labriola. We should say that Dr. Labriola was one of the founders of CAPA.
Well, he came a little bit after I did, but he was president of CAPA. I was president of CAPA after he was, and he's a wonderful person and a very good writer. Doesn't need a lot of editing anymore because he's honed his skills. But
and so if somebody wants to find CAPA, it's www.
about CAPA, ABOUTCAPA.com. And there you will find all of the authorities that I've written in for the last 4 years. and my column will appear either on the back page, as that one is, or in the middle of the issue with my picture, and you can read all about how to be a better writer and communicator.
So give us some examples of common mistakes that people make that you've written about in your articles.
Okay.
You can read straight from that if you need to, or that you found in books, and really interesting mistakes, or common mistakes.
Common mistakes are the homonyms, which are words like there and there and there. T-H-E-I-R, T-H-E-R-E, T-H-E-Y, apostrophe R-E. You would be surprised how many people don't know the differences.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's I-T apostrophe S and I-T-S, and there's no I-T-S apostrophe, although you would be surprised how many people add things to words, misspell words, etc.
I find, just from my own work, a lot of people mistake the word ask. They say ax, A-K-S, instead of A-S-K.
Right.
Do you see that a lot as misspelled in writings?
Sometimes it's misspelled, and one of the things I expanded my business to include helping people to speak orally and in public, because ax sounds like you're chopping something down,
sure.
And we don't want people to say that if that's not what they mean.
They're not George Washington
And
chopping
they're not
down
George
the cherry
Washington,
tree.
and so that's a very common error. There are many kinds of errors that people are totally unaware of. One of the things I find in people's writing is inconsistencies in the spelling of proper names. They might spell it once with an S, once without an S. People don't like to see their names misspelled. Mm-hmm. So it's really important. And also inconsistencies in verb tense. One sentence will be in the present, the next sentence will be in the past. And if they really want to impress people, they try to convolute everything into subjunctive and conditional. You don't need to do that. Simple is best. Mm-hmm. Less is more. So it's important to write so that your audience understands what you're writing and doesn't question what you mean. And that's one of the things an editor can help people with.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Give me another example of a common mistake. Well, let's hear a funny mistake. Have you ever bumped into a funny mistake that maybe you saw from somewhere else or that you ran into?
There are a lot of funny mistakes, but of course when you put me on the spot it's a little harder.
Well, if you can remember.
But adding the word not when you mean no, or never when you mean always, it can be pretty serious. It can be a pretty serious error. Mm-hmm. I would suggest that when people write, they read their material aloud to somebody else, because as you read it, you hear your mistakes, mm-hmm. and if you don't, your audience will. And writers groups are really good for this, support writers groups, where you read a page or two every week or every other week to a group of 5 or 6 people, so that they give you their input. I'll tell you, it makes my work a lot easier, mm-hmm. because a lot of the nitty-gritty, simple problems are solved in a writer's group, mm-hmm. so that when the editor gets it, she or he can really focus on the more important elements of the story and mm-hmm. not be bogged down with all the nitty-gritty grammatical and spelling errors and wrong tense and wrong meanings sometimes. Mm-hmm. I had an email from a publisher the other day. I'd asked for her address because I needed to send her a letter. And she misspelled her name in the email. And I looked at it and I said, this is wrong. And I Googled her. Mm-hmm. And I found out the spelling was incorrect.
By emails, people do make it there.
No, but she wrote her name and her address.
Oh, you mean it was in the signature?
In the signature.
In the actual signature. Oh, okay.
Right, right.
That's a boo-boo.
I didn't want to tell her. I didn't tell her. I just wrote to her using the correct spelling.
Uh-huh, and she probably picked that up.
I hope so. I haven't heard from her, so maybe she wasn't pleased.
Are you working? Now you told us about something that you're working on now with the 89-year-old businessman. Yeah. Are you working on anything else now? Well, maybe a little bit more about your memoir or about your story.
Well, I'm working on memoirs are very popular these days.
What's the difference between? I actually know this. I'm going to ask you anyways.
You want to put me on the spot?
No. You're the professional. What's the difference between a memoir and a biography? Because, as you know, I wrote a memoir too,
Yes.
but I didn't want it to be a biography. I didn't want it to be the whole of
That's
my
right.
story, but I wanted to take a certain section of a story, like when
Right.
I also lived in Israel. So that's
You wrote a
that's
great
a
book.
memoir?
That's a memoir because a biography or autobiography tends to be very inclusive of your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a memoir, you choose what you want to put into it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can even make the stories go into more detail because you have more space to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to put in all the boring stuff. You can put in just interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so memoirs are very popular
That's what I
today.
did.
I know.
I was
know.
able to cut out some of the stuff I didn't want to talk about.
Right. Right.
But in a biography, that would include everything? a
More or
biography?
less, you...
Because they're more interested in the history of it.
Right.
Good, bad, and ugly.
Right.
You know?
But
Got it.
But a lot of people are writing memoirs, and right now I'm editing a memoir for a person who was a child during World War II in England.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the bombing raids and the fears and all the issues that they had as growing up in England, which is an interesting take. The issue with that book is that he's writing in British English for an American audience, and a lot of Americans won't understand it. So I'm circling a lot of words. I may know the definitions, I may know what they mean, but a lot of people won't. They use boot. Boot, to us, is something you wear on your foot.
Right.
Boot to them is the trunk of the car, for example.
Oh, okay.
So-
Now, as I said, I also lived in Israel, and Israel was a British mandate,
Right.
and the older Israelis learned British English. The
Right.
next generation Israelis learned Russian English, and then now they speak American English, and it's a real mishmash. And I know that when I was there, and then before I came back to the States, I had already learned British English, and I had a problem when I came back to the States realizing which words and which is the correct spelling. Like when you say specialize, in English, in American,
You put
we
a
don't
Z.
speak English, we speak American, by the way. I
American
used a Z instead of S. I didn't know I spoke American till I was in Israel. Then I was told I don't speak the proper Queen's English.
Yes.
Or Q is standing in line.
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
we say tomato instead
Well,
of
tomato and tomato are kind of both American.
That's okay.
But, yeah, a Q is a
It was
line.
a Q, or
It's not-
center, C-N-T-R-E, instead of C-E-N-T-E-R.
Right.
That totally confused me, because
Right.
I thought that
and
was the
this
proper
was something
writing.
I had to pay a lot of attention to.
So did you
in
write
writing
British
this.
English, or did you write American English?
I actually wrote American English because we were an American publication.
Okay.
The publisher was from the United States, and I was from the United States. And also we figured that there was a large American population. And the British understand American English,
They do.
but the Americans don't always understand British
the Brit-
English.
Is there a difference between British English from England and, let's say, you might not know this though, but let's say Australia or New Zealand?
Well, they have different accents.
They have different accents, but is the writing the same?
The writing is more or less British because
Okay.
they are
They were
former
British
British
colonies.
colonies, and they're in the Commonwealth. And
But America was a colony at once too.
yeah, but we rebelled and got out of there.
We changed the
We're
writing
still
too.
in the Commonwealth.
We also changed the writing.
But last night I was listening to the Queen's concert, and
Uh-huh.
"My Country 'Tis of Thee" is our song, and "God Save the Queen" is theirs, but it's the same melody, the same music. So I thought that's really interesting.
Well, we're closing now, and
Okay.
if you could sign for me one of your
Oh, sure.
Authority magazine articles, okay, that would be really nice. Would you have one over there that's better? Maybe that one. That would be a
Okay.
nice one.
All right.
We do a signing. Usually we have a book, but in this case we're going to sign an article.
And this
in
will
a
go into your
magazine.
archives?
This will go into my archive
Okay, wonderful.
of Meet the Author. And thank you, Roberta, for being on our show.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.